we have Brandon Brice. He's with the Project 21, the National Center for Public Policy Research, and he's working on his MBA. And welcome to the show, Brandon.
Thank you for having me.
And Brandon and I were practically neighbors growing up. We're talking about the different streets and where we grew up, and it's a very different world. He's from the Detroit area, and I grew up in the Detroit area, but where you grew up in that area was very different, depending on the street name back in the day.
It was because at that time, I grew up at a time where Detroit was, in a sense, at its worst. Crime was high. The economy was not good. The auto suppliers were pulling out. But ironically, when you're a kid, you don't know you're poor, and so a lot of times I say, my parents would say, well, that was, the worst times of our lives raising kids. But for me, it was the best time because in all of those issues, what you had was a sense of community. You had parents who cared. You had teachers who gave a damn. And so it was one of those things where, in the midst of all of the economic challenges that were happening in Detroit at that time, we really had that sense of community. And so it's interesting to see today where I question, do we still have that sense of community, that sense of parents who were serious about their children's education, that sense of educators who cared and refused to pass students who couldn't read, not just because the administration said to do that. And so I think we need to go essentially back to basics.
It's interesting that you'd say that, because when you go on your Netflix or your Amazon Prime or wherever you search movies, and if you want to see, based on a true story kind of thing, and where you see like the Horatio Alger stories or the football team that, we just watched, I'll think of the name later, but the football team, it was right when desegregation hit in the South. And so the white boys wouldn't play with the black boys, and they were fighting against each other, and they brought in a coach that, it was very biblical in scope. But many of those movies, maybe they've had more time to make them, but you see a lot more from that time era versus now, as far as that unity that you're talking about, that you can achieve it.
Back in those, even if you go with, Ron Clark, who was a young, white, hipster, who got a job working in, I believe it was Brooklyn or the Bronx, and he realized his kids couldn't read. And he said, wait a minute, this is wrong. And so it goes back to my message on education reform, which is saying your zip code should never determine your altitude or how high you can go or how much you can achieve.
Right.
And we need to call it out. This is the civil rights movement of our time. And I joke to say, in a sense, in the 60s and the 50s, Black folks couldn't get in to these schools due to, desegregation. Now we can't get out of the failing schools. And so I think this is something that parents across the board need to be aware of. They need to understand that there is a movement that wants to keep them out of their children's education, knowing what their children are learning. You would be amazed to know what your 7 or 8-year-old is learning in the classroom. And I can tell you this, it ain't reading, math, and arithmetic.
So I want to take a pause here because I want to catch up and share a little bit of your background, and we'll dive more into the subject, because I want to talk about school choice. And like you said, they wanted to get in schools. Now they want to get out of schools. Because, and it's not necessarily because of the neighborhood that you're in. It's like, what are they teaching, and why aren't they letting parents, first, they don't want you to know most of everything, whether your child is changing sexes or they're, indoctrinating them. They don't want you to know. They're hostile towards the parents. And it used to be like when you grew up and the parents cared, it mattered. We mattered. Our kids' education mattered. So Brandon began his career on Capitol Hill, working as a staffer for U.S. Speaker Dennis Hastert. And you're working on your second master's right now in business. And you also served as Director of Education and African American Affairs for New Jersey Governor Chris Christie. So you have a wide variety of experiences. And so right now, we're going to talk later about the problem with reparation. But for this segment, let's continue talking about education in the Black community in the United States, and what are we missing? What should be happening?
Well, I'm gonna correct you. It's not just education in the Black community, it's education in America.
Yeah,
It's
there you
Amen.
go. Okay.
And the
Thank you.
reality is, it doesn't matter if you're Black. We're seeing the same issue with certain communities in white neighborhoods where they may not, when you think about your Appalachian Mountains, they have the same issues that you
Yep.
would see in urban areas. And it's interesting. I think if you really want to understand the grasp of this, Vice President Vance's book, Hillbilly Elegy, speaks
Mm-hmm.
to the issue of what happens when you have a breakdown in education, you have a breakdown in jobs, and you have unfortunate access to those things like narcotics and drugs. They don't pick races, they pick class, they pick people who are down on their luck. And I think the challenge is that when you don't have a thriving economy, this is what happens. The opioid crisis doesn't decide, that it's going to affect you if you're Black or white or old or young. It's affecting people at a rapid rate, all people. And why? Because in a sense, we need to have a conversation around mental health in this country. We need to have a conversation about what does quality education look like. And the reality is we need to have a conversation on what does work look like in America. Believe it or not, there are people that don't understand the concept of work. And that could mean work ethic. That could mean, when you were a 10-year-old and you had a paper route, you learned more things of how to be an entrepreneur, how to run a business, how to get up on time, how to have a customer base. And you didn't even realize it because you were having fun and making money. But all of those things are small things that train the next generation of workforce. And I'll be honest with you, I think we need to have an honest conversation in this country about what should be the proper age that a young person needs to be exposed to work.
Amen to that.
Amen. Yeah, we
Yeah.
all worked way before the working age. We found ways to work, whether babysitting or housework or paper routes. So when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about education, but I also want to talk about reparations and why it's a bad idea. So don't go away.
Sure.